Canada is, a vast country. It stretches from the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific and north to the Arctic. Its story is as big as its landscape. It is a tale of ice, forests, mountains, and prairies. But it is also a story of people who have called this land home for thousands of years. This essay will take you on a journey through time. We will explore Canada's past, from its earliest days to the present. We will uncover the stories that have shaped this nation. It is a history filled with courage, conflict, and change. Understanding this history helps us understand the Canada of today. The story of Canada does not begin with the arrival of ships from Europe. It starts much, much earlier. It begins in a time when massive sheets of ice covered the land. This was the Ice Age. These glaciers were powerful forces of nature. They scraped and carved the earth beneath them. They created the lakes, rivers, and mountains we see today. When the ice finally retreated, it left behind a new world, a world ready for life to begin. This ancient landscape is the first chapter in Canada's long and fascinating story. It set the stage for everything that was to come. Imagine a world without cities or roads, a world of dense forests and wide-open plains. This was the Canada that emerged from the Ice Age. Animals like the woolly mammoth and the giant beaver roamed this land. The air was clean and the rivers ran clear. It was a wild and untamed place. This natural world was not just a backdrop for history. It was an active participant. The geography of Canada shaped how people lived. It determined where they settled, what they ate, and how they traveled. The land itself is a character in our story. This journey through Canada's history is important. It is not just a collection of dates and famous names. It is the story of how a diverse group of people came to share a country. It is about the struggles they faced and the successes they achieved. We will see how different cultures met, sometimes in peace and sometimes in conflict. We will learn how a nation was built, piece by piece. This history belongs to everyone who calls Canada home. It helps us see who we are and how we got here. It is a story that is still being written every single day. Long before Canada was a country, it was a homeland. The first people arrived thousands of years ago. They were hunters, fishers, and gatherers. They followed the herds of animals across a land bridge that once connected Asia and North America. These were the ancestors of Canada's Indigenous peoples. They were pioneers in a new world. They learned to survive in harsh climates. They adapted to the different environments they found. From the frozen Arctic to the lush forests of the coast, they built thriving societies. Their story is the true beginning of Canada's human history. These first inhabitants were not one single group. They were many distinct nations. Each had its own language, culture, and traditions. The Haida of the Pacific coast were master carvers. They built massive cedar canoes and totem poles. The Cree of the plains were skilled buffalo hunters. Their lives revolved around the great herds. The Iroquois of the Great Lakes region were farmers. They lived in longhouses and formed powerful political alliances. These diverse cultures were rich and complex. They had deep spiritual beliefs and a profound connection to the land that sustained them. The contributions of Indigenous peoples are foundational to Canada. They developed sophisticated knowledge of the natural world. They understood the seasons, the plants, and the animals. This knowledge was essential for survival. It was passed down from one generation to the next through stories and ceremonies. They created systems of government and trade networks that stretched across the continent. They were the original innovators and explorers of this land. Their presence and their histories are woven into the very fabric of Canada. Their story is not just a prelude to European arrival. It is a central part of the nation's identity. As we begin this exploration of Canada's past, we start with them. We must acknowledge the deep roots of Indigenous peoples on this land. Their history is not a separate story, but the first act in a long and continuing drama. It is a history of resilience and creativity. It is a story of community and survival. By understanding their world, we can better understand the complex events that followed. The arrival of newcomers from across the ocean would change this land forever. But the story of Canada will always begin with its first peoples, the original inhabitants of this vast and incredible land. The human story of Canada begins with a journey of incredible endurance. It started during the last ice age, a time when much of the world was locked in ice. A wide land bridge, known as Beringia, connected what is now Siberia and Alaska. It was not a barren, icy path, but a vast, treeless plain, teeming with life. Small, resilient family groups of hunters followed herds of large animals, like mammoths and caribou, across this bridge. They were not seeking a new continent, they were simply following their food source. These were the very first people to set foot in North America, the ancestors of all indigenous peoples in the Americas. Their arrival was not a single event, but a slow migration that unfolded over thousands of years. As the massive ice sheets that covered Canada began to melt, new pathways opened up. One route ran along the Pacific coast, while another opened up through an ice-free corridor in the interior. These early peoples, often called Paleo-Indians, were pioneers in the truest sense. They carried with them sophisticated skills for survival. They knew how to make sharp stone tools for hunting and butchering. They knew how to create warm clothing from animal hides. They were experts at navigating and understanding a changing and often unforgiving landscape. As they spread out across the vast, empty continent, they adapted to the diverse environments they encountered. The land was rich with new resources. There were immense forests, powerful rivers, and endless plains. The people learned the rhythms of this new world. They discovered which plants were good for food and medicine. They learned the habits of the local animals. This deep, intimate knowledge of the land was not just practical, it became the foundation of their cultures and spiritual beliefs. The land was not something to be owned or conquered. It was a living entity, a provider and a teacher deserving of respect. Over many generations, these small wandering groups grew into distinct societies. They settled in different regions, from the windswept Arctic tundra to the temperate rainforests of the coast. Their languages evolved, their traditions multiplied, and their cultures blossomed. The single story of a few brave migrants became a rich tapestry of many different nations. Each developed a unique way of life, perfectly suited to their specific corner of the continent. This period of settlement laid the groundwork for the incredible diversity of indigenous cultures that would greet the first Europeans centuries later. They were not newcomers. They were the original inhabitants, with a history stretching back into the mists of time. On the Pacific coast of British Columbia, the land and sea provided incredible abundance. Cedar trees and salmon shaped the lives of the Haida, Tsimshian, Nuu-chah-nulth, and Coast Salish peoples. Cedar built their homes, canoes, and art, while salmon fed their communities and inspired celebration. Their wealth and status were shared through potlatch feasts, uniting families and honoring tradition. On the Great Plains, nations like the Siksika, Cree, and Assiniboine depended on the bison for food, clothing, and shelter. Their nomadic lives followed the herds, using every part of the animal. In the eastern woodlands, the Haudenosaunee and Wendat farmed corn, beans, and squash, living in permanent villages and longhouses. The Haudenosaunee Confederacy united 5 nations under the Great Law of Peace. For Indigenous peoples, spirit and daily life were one. The land, animals, and sky were alive with meaning. Stories and ceremonies passed down wisdom, teaching each generation their place and responsibility. This vibrant world, rich in tradition and spirit, is the essential first chapter in Canada's history. For thousands of years, this land belonged to Indigenous peoples. Then, Norse explorers led by Leif Erikson landed in Newfoundland, but their stay was brief. Centuries later, John Cabot arrived, sparking a rush for codfish and fleeting encounters with the Mi'kmaq and Beothuk. Jacques Cartier soon followed, mapping the St. Lawrence and opening the door to the fur trade, forever reshaping the continent. While the search for gold and a path to Asia had failed, Europeans soon realized Canada held another kind of treasure: fur. In Europe, beaver felt hats were a massive fashion craze, and the demand for beaver pelts was honestly insatiable. The forests of North America were teeming with beavers and other fur-bearing animals. This discovery shifted the focus of French ambitions. The goal was no longer just exploration, but the creation of a vast commercial enterprise built on the fur trade. This trade would become the economic engine of the French colonial project and would define its relationship with Indigenous peoples for generations to come. It was a business that required partnership, not conquest. In 1608, another great French explorer, Samuel de Champlain, established a permanent settlement at a strategic point on the St. Lawrence River. He called it Quebec. This small trading post was more than just a fort. It was the beginning of New France. Champlain, often called the father of New France, understood that the success of the fur trade depended entirely on building strong relationships with the local indigenous nations. He formed crucial alliances with the Wendat, also known as the Huron, the Algonquin, and the Inuit. These groups controlled the supply of furs from the interior, and in exchange for European goods, they brought a steady stream of pelts to Quebec. This partnership was a complex one. The French provided goods that transformed indigenous life, including metal tools, firearms, and textiles. Firearms, in particular, dramatically changed the balance of power among indigenous nations. The French, in turn, relied on indigenous knowledge and technology to survive and travel in the vast wilderness. They learned to use snowshoes in the winter and to navigate the intricate network of rivers and lakes in birch bark canoes. Young Frenchmen, known as coureurs des bois, runners of the woods, lived among their indigenous partners, learning their languages and customs as they pushed deeper into the continent in search of furs. The fur trade created a unique society in New France, one built on interdependence between Europeans and indigenous peoples. It pulled the French far into the interior of the continent, following the trade routes that had existed for centuries. They established a chain of small forts and trading posts along the Great Lakes and down the Mississippi River. Unlike the English colonies to the south, which were based on agriculture and clearing the land, New France was a vast commercial network spread thinly across the landscape. Its survival and prosperity were woven together with the lives and fortunes of its indigenous allies, creating a distinct French-Canadian identity from the very beginning. In New France, the fur trade thrived, but the French crown wanted a stable colony. The seigneurial system divided land along the St. Lawrence River, with seigneurs overseeing settlers called habitants. Life was tough, clearing forests, farming rocky soil, and surviving harsh winters. The church shaped daily life, running schools and hospitals. To grow the population, the king sent the Filles du Roi, founding mothers of Quebec. The French were not the only European power with ambitions in North America. To the south, along the Atlantic coast, the English had established a series of much larger and more populous colonies. While New France was a sprawling fur-trading empire with a small population, the English colonies were compact, agricultural societies with a rapidly growing number of settlers who were hungry for land. These two empires, France and Britain, were historic rivals in Europe, and their competition inevitably spilled over into the New World. From the late 1600s onward, they were locked in a struggle for control of the continent. A key difference between the two empires was their relationship with indigenous peoples. The French, with their focus on the fur trade, built a network of alliances based on trade and military cooperation. They integrated themselves into existing indigenous networks. The English, on the other hand, had a relationship based more on land. As their farming settlements expanded westward, they came into increasing conflict with indigenous nations over territory. The English formed their own crucial alliance with the powerful Haudenosaunee, or Iroquois Confederacy, who were the traditional rivals of the French and their Wendat allies. This set the stage for a series of proxy wars, where indigenous nations were drawn into the larger imperial conflict. The competition between Britain and France was fought over key strategic resources and territories. One major area of conflict was the rich fur trading country of the Ohio Valley. Both empires claimed this region and built forts to defend their interests. Another contested area was Acadia, which is now Nova Scotia and New Brunswick. The French-speaking Acadian settlers there were caught in the middle of this imperial rivalry. The British also wanted to break the French monopoly on the fur trade. In 1670, they established the Hudson's Bay Company, which set up trading posts on the shores of Hudson Bay, creating a northern front in the economic war for furs. This rivalry led to a series of 4 major colonial wars fought between 1689 and 1763. These were not just battles between European armies, they were brutal conflicts that involved raids on settlements and frontier warfare, with both sides using their indigenous allies. Forts were captured and recaptured, and control of territory shifted back and forth. This long period of instability and violence created a deep sense of insecurity in New France and hardened the divisions between the two European powers. Each battle and each treaty only set the stage for the next conflict, leading inevitably towards a final, decisive showdown for the future of North America. In the mid-1700s, the British expelled thousands of Acadians from their homes in what's now Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, and Prince Edward Island. Families were torn apart, villages burned, and the Acadian community scattered across distant lands. This tragic event, known as the Great Upheaval, remains one of the darkest chapters in Canadian history. The expulsion of the Acadians was just the beginning. Soon, the 7 Years' War erupted, a global struggle between Britain and France for control of North America. In 1759, General Wolfe led a British fleet to Quebec, laying siege to the city, perched high on a cliff. In a daring move, British troops climbed to the Plains of Abraham, forcing a decisive battle. The British won, both commanders fell, and New France's fate was sealed. The British now controlled North America. After New France fell, French Canadians faced an uncertain future under British rule. Many feared deportation, but the British needed their loyalty, especially with unrest in the 13 colonies. The Quebec Act of 1774 reversed harsh policies, restored French civil law, and guaranteed Catholic rights, securing French-Canadian culture under British rule. The Quebec Act pleased French-Canadian leaders, but angered American colonists, who saw it as a threat. When the Revolution began, the French-Canadians stayed neutral, keeping Canada British. After the American victory, thousands of Loyalists fled north, changing Canada's population and demanding British laws and assemblies. The Constitutional Act of 1791 split Quebec into Upper and Lower Canada, recognizing two cultures, yet planting seeds for future conflict. In 1867, Canada was just 4 provinces, but leaders like Sir John A. Macdonald dreamed of a nation stretching from the Atlantic to the Pacific. The purchase of Rupert's Land in 1870 instantly transformed Canada's size and potential. British Columbia joined in 1871, lured by the promise of a transcontinental railway. Prince Edward Island followed in 1873, and the dream of a nation from sea to sea was becoming real. The promise of a transcontinental railway to British Columbia became the national dream, a ribbon of steel uniting Canada. It linked distant provinces, carried settlers, and transformed the prairies into Canada's breadbasket. Thousands of Chinese laborers braved perilous work, their sacrifice essential but long overlooked. With the last spike in 1885, the national dream was realized, binding Canada from coast to coast. With the railway complete, Canada launched a massive campaign to fill the West, offering free land to settlers. Posters promised golden fields and prosperity, drawing millions from Europe and beyond. Ukrainians, Poles, Germans, and others arrived, bringing new languages and traditions. The reality was harsh. Settlers faced isolation, sod houses, and brutal weather. Despite hardships, they built farms and communities, transforming the prairies. This wave of immigration reshaped Western Canada, laying the foundation for a diverse, resilient society. The newcomers' determination turned the promise of the West into reality. The West was never empty. Indigenous peoples and Métis had deep roots there. Settlers and railways threatened their lands and ways of life. treaties were often broken and many were forced onto reserves. The Métis, led by Louis Riel, resisted with the Red River and Northwest resistances. Their victories were short-lived. Riel was exiled, then executed after a final stand. The government's military might crushed resistance, ending hopes for an independent Indigenous and Métis West. These conflicts left a legacy of injustice and division. The West's transformation came at a tragic cost for its original peoples. Canada entered World War I as a British colony, but emerged with a new sense of nationhood. Canadian troops proved themselves at Vimy Ridge, earning respect and heavy losses. The war spurred economic growth and brought women into the workforce. Conscription divided English and French Canadians, deepening old wounds. Over 60,000 Canadians died, but the country gained autonomy and a seat at the peace table. The sacrifices of war forged a distinct Canadian identity. Canada was no longer just a colony, it was becoming a nation. The pain and pride of the Great War shaped Canada's future. Quebec's Quiet Revolution transformed a traditional, church-dominated society into a modern, secular one. The province asserted control over education, health, and the economy, fueling a new Quebecois nationalism. Calls for autonomy grew, with some demanding independence. René Lévesque's Parti Québécois made sovereignty a political force. The federal government responded with bilingualism and a push for unity. Tensions led to 2 referendums, nearly splitting the country. The Quiet Revolution redefined Quebec and challenged Canadian unity. The debate over Quebec's place in Canada became central to national politics. Post-war immigration made Canada one of the world's most diverse nations. The government embraced multiculturalism, encouraging all cultures to thrive. Instead of a melting pot, Canada became a mosaic of identities. Multiculturalism was enshrined in law, shaping a tolerant, inclusive society. Critics worried about division, especially in Quebec, but the policy endured. Canada's identity now celebrates diversity as a strength. Building a truly inclusive society remains an ongoing challenge. Canada emerged as an independent voice on the world stage, championing peacekeeping and diplomacy. Lester Pearson's UN peacekeeping initiative earned a Nobel Prize and defined Canada's global image. Canadian peacekeepers served worldwide, symbolizing the nation's commitment to peace. Close ties with the U.S. brought prosperity but also cultural challenges. Canada promoted its own stories and values to maintain its identity. The country now balances its dual heritage, multicultural reality, and Indigenous reconciliation. Canada's identity is ever-evolving, a blend of history, diversity, and global engagement. The story of Canada is a work in progress, shaped by its people and place in the world. Canada's story begins in the Ice Age, with Indigenous peoples building rich societies across the land. Their cultures and struggles echo today, shaping the nation's soul. French and British arrivals brought conflict and duality, defining Canada's identity and politics. Expansion westward united the country, but at great cost to Indigenous and Métis peoples. A legacy still felt in the quest for reconciliation. Canada's identity was forged in the crucible of global conflict, with sacrifices in 2 world wars, giving rise to a new sense of self. Yet, deep divisions, especially between English and French Canada, showed that our identity was woven from many threads. Waves of immigration added new threads, transforming Canada into a multicultural mosaic. Canada's story is a tapestry, complex, ever-changing, and defined by unity and diversity. Canada's story is still being written, shaped by its layered history, diverse peoples, and ongoing challenges. Reconciliation with Indigenous peoples and building unity remain unfinished business. Yet, Canada's resilience and spirit of